This week is Parshas Vayera, and it is, of course, everybody knows, the second full parsha that deals with Avrohom Avinu. To be sure, next week, Parshas Chayei also deals with Avrohom Avinu, although you would know it, because we spent most of the parsha with the shidduch of Yitzchak and Rivka. Avrohom Avinu is, of course, the brains behind it. Avrohom Avinu is the initiative behind it. But it's mostly about what's called Eved Avrohom. Avrohom Avinu's servant is making arrangements to provide a kala, to provide a wife for Yitzchak Avinu. But next week is also Avrohom Avinu's parsha. This week is the parsha in between, the middle parsha. Last week is Parshas Avrohom Avinu. This week is Parshas Avrohom Avinu. And next week is more or less Parshas Avrohom Avinu. Our parsha begins after the Bris Milah. And as I explained to you, it seems to me that you can divide Avrohom Avinu's life into 5 steps, 5 evolutionary steps. The first is the search, with using his mind to try and find Hashem. The second is prophecy. Hashem inspires him with Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. The third is where Hashem gives him a mitzvah, Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha nebeis avicha. And the fourth is Bris Milah. All those 4 points were in last week's parsha. Our parsha begins, Avrohom just had a bris, and of course Avrohom has a problem. Avrohom has a sickness. Besides for his physical ailments associated with the bris, Avrohom has a problem. Avrahom's problem is that Avrohom was obsessively kind. Mamish. In today's society, they would call him codependent. You know, if a shrink would get a hold of Avrohom Avinu, he'd call him codependent. If God forbid Avrohom can't help another person, he's oismech. Avrohom wasn't codependent. Avrohom Avinu was chesed atzilis. You know that it says, there's a story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a story. And as the story goes, they don't tell such stories about me. I made 20 copies, so there's still a few left. There's a few sitting right here. You can take those, hand them out. There was a Jew who lived in New York whose name was Reb Mendel Kunyan. That's the story. Reb Mendel Kunyan was the grandfather of the Zion Gezut Nishtai, the Rebbe Shliach California, Reb Shlomo Kunyan. And he was a sheikhet. And shachtim in America did okay, apparently. It was a way to make a living. But in addition to being a sheikhet, he was an investor, and he was a good investor. So he had panosa barchava. He made a living. And his house starved. There was nothing to eat. Because his chush in tzedakah, his generosity was mamish reckless. He gave everything away to tzedakah. Ad kedei kach that his wife, his Rebbetzin, came to the Friedrich Rebbe and complained that her husband makes a living and the money doesn't get home. Like the mice with the Blacham Chernobyl, it doesn't get home, doesn't make it. So the Friedrich Rebbe told her the following: Du bist gerecht. You're right. Aber was ich tun, na seine rechte Hand is a keli for chesed atzilus. What am I to do that his right hand is a vessel for chesed of atzilus? Chesed of bria would be not bad, by the way. Chesed of atzilus means a human being who lived in the last half a century. His right hand was a keli for Ein Sof, for chesed of Ein Sof. So the Rebbe tells his wife, you're right, he shouldn't give so much tzedakah, but I'm not going to stop him. In atzilus, chesed is blig vul. I know of several people who were over the top when it came to tzedakah. I know a particular man who the Rebbe told him in Yechidus, give me your checkbook. The Rebbe said, give me your checkbook. And the Rebbe took his checkbook and handed it to his wife and said, you write no checks. And that's how they work. That's how they had shalom bayis. Because he was incredibly generous. He gave a gewalt mitzvah. But this Jew, the Rebbe didn't say, give me your checkbook. The Rebbe said to his wife, he's a keli for chesed atzilus. Avrohom Avinu was chesed of atzilus. Like it says in Sefer Rabbi, it says in Medrash, that Omra Midas HaChesed Afnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the attribute of kindness says to God that Miyem Hayes Avrohom Al Pnei Adam, from the time that Avrohom Avinu was born, I'm out of a job. I had nothing to do. Anything my Allah had to do. Shavrohom Oimid V'Meshamish B'Mkoimi. Avrohom is standing and functioning in my stead. So Chesed of Atzilus says to the Eibishter, I'm unemployed. I'm dysfunctional. And nobody needs me. But I'm finished. So Avrohom Avinu's chesed was an egvaldike madrege, and as a result, if he didn't have someone to whom to give, it made him sick. So here he is, 99 years old, just went through a serious operation, and Rashi says that he was in a lot of pain, And yet, he's waiting for guests. There's no guests. Why are there no guests? Because the Eibush to remove the sun from its shield, so it was unnaturally hot. There was no chances to walk around. But the Eibush sees Avrohom Avinu's desperation for a Tevetar, so he sends him Shleisha Malachim and Musa Nashim, sends him 3 angels, and the rest is history. They come to Avrohom Avinu, and the Avrohom Avinu begs them to come into his house, and he feeds them, and so on and so forth. Avrohom Avinu's need to give is temporarily quieted and satisfied. And of course, I mentioned this last week already. The incredible thing of Avrohom Avinu was that he was mavaded as mitzvah chesed. He changed it. How did he change it? That even though by nature his generosity knew no limits, he forced himself to insist that the people should thank God. Baruch hu l'misha achalta mishalei. And if they wouldn't thank God, it makes them pay. That gvura, that saying, if you don't bless God, you have to pay me, was completely unnatural to him, because his generosity knew no limits. But this is what the Eibishter wants. So Avrohom Avinu did. Avrohom Avinu lived. Avrohom Avinu lived in Canaan. And like it's implicit in some of the Mefarshim, I think in Rambam especially, that Avrohom Avinu lived in Canaan because the people, they were so primitive that they could tolerate such a heretic like Avrohom Avinu. Could you imagine a fool? Mamish, Azana, he only has one God. How foolish can a man be? I mean, we deal with gods in the dozens. And Avrohom Avinu has one Eibishter. How could he think that one God could run the whole universe? So when he lived in Haran, or in Ur, in the area of Iraq, Babylonia, and then when he moved to Kuta, the Gemara says he lived in a place called Kuta. Kuta is in Haran, Aram Na'arayim. They couldn't suffer such a heretic, so they kicked him out. But the Canaanites were so low that they could suffer even a person like Avrohom Avinu. Avrohom Avinu settles there. And he situates his home on the desert, along the travel routes, right? Everybody knows about the ancient world. But the ancient world was shaped like a fertile crescent, because people had to live near water, primarily for life, for sustenance, and also for transportation, for commerce. So the whole world, the whole ancient world, was a fertile crescent. I mean to say, it went between the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates, which is called Netera, Chidekel, and Pras, up to around the area, I guess, of whatever it is, Jordan, and then down westward on both sides of the Yarden, the river Jordan, which falls into what is now called the Yam HaMelech. At that time, there wasn't the Yam HaMelech. At that time, there was a garden, there was a paradise there, the Kikar, the 5 nations of the. And the whole ancient world ran along this valley of rivers, between Chidekel and Pras, then along the river Yarden, and then down into Egypt along the Nile, the river the Nile, all the way down to Central Africa, where the Yarden, where the Nilus, where the river the Nile has its roots. So people did not travel east to west along the desert. It was impossible. So they traveled around the crescent. They would go out to the Hakofas. If you lived in Ur, if you wanted to go to Canaan, you couldn't go straight west. You had to go all the way up and back. So Avrohom Avinu builds himself a tent right on the road, which means that everybody coming and going is going to pass right by his house in the ancient world. All the merchants, all the machers. And Avrohom had a tent with 4 doors, and his house was always available and always open. He couldn't give enough. And he taught them about the Eibishter. He taught them about tzedakah v'chesed, about kindness. And he taught them about chinuch, raising children to be human beings, not to be chayes terois, chayes perfes. This is Avrohom Avinu's life, this is Avrohom Avinu's legacy. In this week's parsha, we read an interesting thing. Avrohom Avinu lived in Hebron. That's where he lived. He settled in Hebron, around 75 years old, or approximately. He lived there till a little while after the bris. Because a little while after the bris, the Eibishter destroyed the 4 cities of Sodom, Amorah, Admah, and Tzmoyim, and the flow of traffic was reduced to a trickle. Fewer people were traveling hither and thither. So Avrohom relocated. He moved south to a place called AISHEL. Now I don't understand the logistics, but I'm figuring that AISHEL is west of Sodom, because this way he, so to speak, situated himself on what was a new travel route. And Rashi says in Chumash that he lived in Be'er longer than he lived in Hebron, which means to say that at the age of 75, Avrohom Avinu settled in Hebron. At the age of 100, he moved from Hebron to Be'er Sheva, which means he spent 25 years in Hebron. So based on the cloud, that Leiboa cost of listam el lefarish, there's a policy in Torah that whenever the Torah says something vague we presume that the Torah is trying to give us the maximum amount of information. So if it says that he was in Be'er Sheva longer than in Hebron, so Rashi assumes he was in Hebron 25 years, so he was in Be'er Sheva 26 years. So he lived in Hebron from the age of 75 to the age of 100, approximately, a little bit before Yitzchak was born. And around the age of 100, he moved from Hebron to Be'er Sheva, and he lived there 26 years. At the age of 126, and Yitzchak was 26 years old, he moved back to Hebron. He lived in Hebron 11 more years, and after those 11 years, you have the Akedas Yitzchak. So our Pasha describes, of course, the whole story with Shem and Amayra and light, and the birth of Yitzchak, and the move. Avrohom Avinu moves from Hebron to Be'er Sheva, and he relocates. Now, in Hebron, we know Avrohom Avinu lived in Hebron, and he set up a whole situation, a tent, with a whole business. But the Torah does not specifically articulate Avrohom Avinu's accommodations. But when Avrohom Avinu moves to Hebron, relocates to Hebron, because as Rashi says, he wanted to find a new source of travelers, now that Sodom and Amorah have been destroyed. So he relocates to Be'er Sheva. The Torah says what he did. This is the pasuk that you have in front of you on the page that I printed. Vayita AISHEL b'Vayera Shava. He plants a AISHEL. What's an AISHEL? Don't answer. Because we've got about 5 or 6 different opinions. Okay, in the place called Be'er Sheva, Vayikra Sham, and he declares and he announces b'Shem Adeshem, in the name of God, Keil Elam, God and the world. So as I told you this morning in one of the classes, that this means to say that Avrohom Avinu taught people that there's unity between the Eibishter and his world. And the unity between the Eibishter and his world is such that you can't say that the Eibishter is the Balabos over the world, the Eibishter is the master of the world, but you must say that the Eibishter and the world are one. Avrohom Avinu taught the world about God. And to be sure, Avrohom Avinu didn't teach us only about God. He taught about God, he taught about kindness, he taught about chesed, he taught about chinuch. This seems to be the 3 messages, the 3 legacies, if you will, of Avrohom Avinu. So when Avrohom Avinu relocates to Be'er Sheva, the Torah says that he rebuilt the same kind of accommodation he had in Hebron, although in Hebron it doesn't say explicitly in the pasuk that he had such an accommodation. But here it says that he built himself an AISHEL, and the purpose of his AISHEL was to draw people to him. And people, Avrohom was very wealthy, and when they traveled, they would stop at Avrohom Avinu's accommodations. And Avrohom would have an opportunity to teach them and inspire them, which they, of course, would go back and teach and inspire their own people wherever they live. And then the pasuk concludes, Vayogar Avrohom b'Yeretz Plishtim Yonam Rav. And Avrohom lived in the land of Plishtim for many days. So Rashi says, Meruba Mishal Hebron. He was 25 years in Hebron, he was 26 years in Be'er Sheva. So he moved back to Hebron about 11 years before the Akedah. Now, so this is the pasuk. We're going to focus on the first half of this pasuk. Vayita AISHEL b'Be'er Sheva. He planted an AISHEL b'Be'er Sheva. The second half of the pasuk is a couple of years away. Tafshinayim Beis, because next year I'm scheduling to do Eimatachas Eitz. So 2 years from now we'll do Vayita AISHEL Vayikra Sham Hashem Hashem Keil Elam.
So you're saying AISHEL is a tree?
AISHEL, you'll have to find out. And we start.
Before you tell us that it's a tree.
No, 41 years. We start with the Tzadik Gon, which is on the right on the top. Vayita AISHEL. He plants an AISHEL, says Rasag Vayatzev Matzeva. He erected a monument. You never thought of this, huh? The Rasag, Tzadik Gon, says something that no one ever thunk of. He says that Avrohom Avinu settled in Be'er Sheva and he built himself a Mizbeach. In other words, the Tzadik Gon holds that Vayita AISHEL does not mean he made accommodations to attract people to himself, but rather Vayita AISHEL means he built something for his own personal worship. So Tzadik Gon surprises us because none of us ever thought in these terms. But Rasag says Avrohom Avinu moved to a new place and he built himself a new house of worship for himself. And as it says in Chazal that B'mei ha'oves, the matzeva, the monument, the matzeva, the single stone mizbeach was preferred. And later on, the Eibishter said no more matzevas. He's not allowed to make matzevas. One day I'll do a pasha shir on that as well. But the Rasag says that the AISHEL was not for people. He didn't build an AISHEL to draw attention to himself. He built an AISHEL so he should be able to serve Hashem. And the Rashbam confirms it. Rashbam is right beneath the Rasag. Vayita Eshel Pardes Hoya. He built a garden. Lehispalel Sham. To daven there. Now you could read the Pardes two ways. You could say that the Pardes is saying that he built it for other people to pray, but which means he would be very much like Rashi. Or you could say Vayita Eshel, he built a Pardes Lehispalel Sham for himself. What I'm trying to show you is that when you learn Chumash with commentaries, don't decide what they're going to say, because if you do, you're not going to hear them, and you'll frequently find that the Mefarshim will say something you're not expecting, and it will add to the incredible diversity and variety, which is the whole beauty of the Psukim, is how many different ways you can read the same pasuk. So we're going to allow ourselves to interpret the Rab Sadi Gon and Rashbam as that Avrohom Avinu built himself accommodations for his own personal worship. Now it could be that we're not reading the Rashbam correctly, but I believe that we're reading the Rasad correctly. But at least it gives you a different point of view, that the Eshel was not necessarily a tree, it wasn't necessarily a garden, and it wasn't necessarily for other people, it may have been for himself. Now we read the Rashi. Rashi is on the left. Rashi is on the left, at the top. Eshel, you see, Eshel, says Rashi, Rav Ushmuel. There's an argument between two rabbis. One rabbi's name is Rav, and the other rabbi's name is Shmuel. And they have an argument. Chad Amar, one says, Pardes, that Avrohom Avinu built himself a garden, Lahav Mimenu Peiris, from which he could cull many fruit, La'archim B'Seuda, to feed many guests in the feast. So he built an orchard of trees. He planted an orchard of trees, so he should have fresh fruit to feed guests. So Rashi clearly understands the Eshel to be not for personal worship, but as a way of drawing in others. And V'chadam, and the other ones, as Shmuel says, Pundik, a hotel, a hospital, La'achsanya, to host guests, Ubai, Komine, Peyas, all kinds of food. That's all. So both opinions in Rashi say that Vayita Eshel does not mean a matzeva, a monument, or a house of worship for personal worship, but he built accommodations to host people. But one says it means the field which he drew the fruit to feed them, and the other one says it means the hotel where he would feed them from fruit that he got in whatever way. Okay? Now what I would like you to do, please, is to now immediately turn to page 9. This is a Sikha from the Rebbe from Tafshin Mem Zayin, 1986-87, where the Rebbe asks the question that you asked without even realizing it, Leah. Eshel means a tree. You don't need to interpret the word appears in Tanakh. Eshel means a tree, but it means a single tree. Okay? So Rashi says, Vayita Eshel, either an orchard, many trees, or a pundit. What about translating the word as the word is meant in Hebrew? Says the Rebbe, Vihine. You see my arrow? Vihine? Af shekvar duber eides pirish Rashi zeh. We've already discussed this Rashi on a previous occasion. Says the Rebbe, duber rak, the only thing I discussed was eides bir ashita de Rav Shmuel, to explain the opinions of Rav Shmuel. Skip the parenthesis, please. There's a fundamental question here, a core question, a 5-year-old's question, and the question is the L'chaira Hapirush Aposha de Eshel Hu Ilon. Eshel means a single tree, like Pardes, not a garden full of trees. Like Pundik, it's not a hotel. So Rashi is supposed to be a Pashtan. Rashi's whole self-identity is Aniloi Basi Lefarish Elo. Pshutei shal mikra, my sentiment, my priority, my attitude, as I give you a simple version, refuses to translate the pasuk as the pasuk is self-understood. Everybody knows Eshel means a tree, and if you look at the next paragraph, which I'm going to skip, he quotes a pasuk in Tanakh where you see Vayikpru tachas Eshel. Eshel means a tree. So the Rebbe asks, I don't understand. Versteh nicht. When the Rashi says, when the pasuk says the words Vayita Eshel ve'eshava, Rashi should say nothing at all. Because we know Eshel means a tree. So Rashi says, well, it doesn't mean a tree. It either means many trees, or it means a hotel. Why? Eshel means a tree. Go to the left side of the page, please. The answer to this question or why Rashi insists in translating the word Vayita Eshel not as an individual tree, but as a collection of trees. It's very simple. When you read that Avrohom Avinu settled in southern Israel, in a place called Be'er Sheva, right on a Be'er. What does a Be'er mean? A well. And he plants a tree, Eshel is Shaila Pshuta. You scratch your head and say, I don't understand. The Torah has to tell us Avrohom planted a tree. It's like doing a version of history. Doing a version of history of George Washington, and you say, and he ate breakfast. Everybody knows George Washington ate breakfast. It's not part of history. He ate breakfast. Every day he ate breakfast. Right? And when he had a cold, he blew his nose. That's not recorded in history books. Why? Because it's not relevant. It's not of historical significance. For Avrohom Avinu to plant a tree is like for George Washington to eat breakfast. Of course he planted trees. Specifically in the city of Vayera Sheva, which is like Makay Midbar, but it was not a desert. Ki Makayim Yishuv, it was a very, very fertile place that Avrohom Avinu settled there. My Helik is Eideh Rashi. Why must the Torah state the obvious? Of course he planted trees. So Rashi has no choice. And to say that Vayita Eshel does not mean a solitary tree, doesn't mean a single tree. Because if it meant a single tree, the Torah wouldn't tell us that he planted trees. It's obvious. And therefore Rashi has two choices. Ubeglal shaylazu, and because of this question, lo yochal Rashi lefarish she'eshel hu ilan. He cannot interpret that Eshel means a single tree. Skip the parenthesis. Sha'arei behechirach loimer, it's an imperative. You have to say she'eshel kan eina ilan stam. The word Eshel here cannot mean simply a tree, because then the Torah wouldn't tell it to us. El inyan miyuchad, has to be something extraordinary. What's extraordinary? Number one, pardes. What's pardes? A garden with multiple trees. Leirat ilan echad, a pardes shal, not just one tree but many trees. I put or a hotel. Asher al yadai nikra shmei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu el hakala kol elam, which allowed the Eibishter's name to be disseminated. So the word Vayita Eshel immediately raises a question. Why would the Torah tell us that Avrohom Avinu is planting a tree? And the answer is the Torah is not telling us Avrohom Avinu planted a tree. But it says he planted a tree, so the answer is either he planted a whole orchard of trees or he planted a hotel. So because the simple translation of Vayita Eshel is so ordinary that it doesn't belong in the Torah shouldn't have to say it, Rashi is compelled to translate Eshel extraordinarily as a collection of trees or as a hotel. Okay? Now, I want you to hold on to this commentary of the Rebbe, because it's going to become incredibly relevant when the clock is merciful and we get to the Chassidus before it's too late for us to learn it. Because in Chassidus we're going to find, the Chassidus is going to combine Eshel, a singular tree, and Eshel, a bunch of trees, into one interpretation, as you'll see then. I don't want to give it away. Okay? But in the meantime, Vayita Eshel as a singular tree is one interpretation, and Vayita Eshel as an abundance of trees is a different interpretation. Rashi cannot say that Vayita Eshel means a single tree because it's too ordinary, it's too plain. You got it? Okay, we on the same page? So let's review. Rasag says Eshel means a monument for prayer, and it seems that the Rashbam is confirming this, and we're going to presume that Vayita Eshel means that Avrohom Avinu made for himself personally house of prayer. Accordingly, the second half of the pasuk, and he declared the name of God to the world, is a separate issue. He made himself a place to pray. He got others to pray. But Rashi says no, he made this Eshel so that people should pray, so the two are connected. Eshel cannot mean a single tree. Eshel has to mean either an orchard of many trees or a punde, which means a hotel. Okay? Now, follow me, please, to page 5. This is a sefer called Masei Hashem. Masei Hashem is a book of a philosopher. One day I'm going to sit down and write up a few details about him. Next time I bring him in, I'll tell you about him. He was a philosopher who lived around 250 years ago. An incredible God, an incredible Talmud Chacham. And he wrote a commentary on Chumash, just analyzing the stories of the Torah, not the halachas, just the stories. And his favorite commentary that he quotes all the time is Mahari, Mem Hey Reish Yud Aleph, which stands for Harav Yitzchak Abarbanel. He's constantly quoting Abrabanel. But he had some pretty creative chaps. Like, for example, he's the fellow who told us last week that Sarah's name was always Sarah, and that Sarah was simply her juvenile nickname, and that the Eibush Avrohom, Sarah has grown up, it's time that people should call her by her real name. Remember that, Pshat? That's from the same Masih Hashem. You missed last week. Sorry, I have to punish you. Okay, but let's read what he says. Page 5 at the bottom on the right. Vayita Eshel, regarding planting Eshel. So Dar Sherazal, the Gemara says, Commissioner Pirish Rashi, as Rashi quotes, Chadam Padis, one says a garden of many trees. Lahav Yemenu Padis, to bring fruit from, Chadam Pundik Laksanya. And the other one says a hotel as a place of hosting guests. But the Unkelus Tirgeme Kipshute, the Unkelus translates it simply. Elon, what does Elon mean? A single tree. Now we just learned in the Rebbe Sasiche, where the Rebbe explains why Rashi cannot translate that it means a single tree. Because if it meant a single tree, the Torah would not tell us something which is so obvious. Just like it doesn't tell us in the Torah that Avrohom Avinu ate breakfast, the Torah shouldn't tell us that Avrohom planted a tree. Therefore it has to be either many trees or a hotel. But the Unkelus says it. Eshel means a tree. So what the Ma'aseh Hashem does is he tries to synthesize the pshat of Unkelus, the simple translation, that Eshel means a single tree, with Rashi's interpretation that it means a hotel. He says like this. Avo, third line from the top.
Is this an oasis or does Avrohom make it
It's, I don't think it was a desert at all. So you don't have to say an oasis. It was a city. And it was quite fertile. There was a lot of water around. And Avrohom settled in this place, and he built an estate. 3 lines to the top on the left. Avalakayim Divri HaMedrash VaPshat. Says the Masih Hashem, I would like to synthesize the pshat that Elon means a single tree, which Rashi doesn't want to do, and the Medrash that it was either many trees or a hotel. How? Neither. The custom was that when you make a tent, right next to the tent you would plant a tree. Why? For shade. In the beginning of our parsha, when the Malachim come to Avrohom Avinu, and Avrohom Avinu was still living in Hebron, he had not yet moved. So Be'er he says, come sit under the tree. So we know from this, when people would make themselves homes, they would build trees, plant trees for shade. Planting one tree here would be indication that he also made a hotel. It helps the guests rest. So the Masih Hashem does is he walks between the complexities of Rashi. Rashi does not want to translate Eshel as a single tree because it's too simple. But the Masih Hashem says, excuse me, Eshel means a tree. There's nothing you can do about it, and so says the Targum. Right? Yebot, right? Yebot, by the way, is one word. Yebot, it'll be in the 2011 edition of the Oxford Dictionary. Yebot, Oberfort, Yebot. Yebot, planting one tree is no big deal. And Tenet says it wasn't the tree that he planted. It's what else he planted with the tree. With the tree he built a hotel. So the Masih Hashem is saying, Avrohom Avinu is planting a tree is proof that he not only planted a tree, but that he built himself a hotel. So he's choosing between the two pshatim of Rav and Shmuel, Pundak, a hotel, and explaining that Eshel means a tree. So if I've got your attention, we have basically 3 interpretations on the word Vayita Eshel, but it's complicated. Either Vayita Eshel means Avram made for himself a place of worship, or Vayita Eshel means Avram Avinu made a place to draw people to him, so he could teach them about Hashem, by either planting an orchard of trees for fruits, or by building himself a hotel. And we have Vayita Eshel means a single tree, and the Masih Hashem's additional note that the single tree was planted because he built a hotel. I don't understand. How much time does it take to grow? Number 1. Number 2, it doesn't say Vayizra Eshel, it says Vayita Eshel. What the word Vayita means? Yeah? more than a sapling. You can take a tree and transplant it. Take a tree that's 20 feet high, uproot it, and plant it where you are. Take a tree which is 50 feet high. You know, when they build these fancy schmancy hotels, yeah? A hotel has to be perfect. So they bring in with a crane 100-foot palms. Vayita palm tree. Literally 100 feet palms that were growing who knows where, because otherwise they're going to wait for that palm tree to grow. The hotel's going to be knocked down because the style's already going to change. Now we read Radak, back to page 1. I hope you followed, but that was quite clear. Back to page 1. The Radak says the most basic, what we all know. The Radak is in the bottom on the left. Our rabbis interpreted the word the Eshel as follows. Nutrikon, it's an abbreviation for 3 words. Achila, Shtia, Levaya. He fed them, he watered them, and he accompanied them. There's a special halacha that says that when you have guests, you have to walk with them. Now the word Eshel has 2 interpretations. Either Achila, Shtia, Levaya, that's written here, or Achila, Shtia, Lino, to feed them and to water them and to give them a place to sleep. So the Radak is saying, Vayita Eshel, he made the place for people to sleep. Of course, this is entirely consistent with Rashi, but it resolves in part at least the question of the word. Eshel means a single tree. So Rashi says Eshel doesn't mean Eshel. And the Radak says Eshel means Eshel, but Eshel is in the Trikon. It's an abbreviation. But the Radak adds a moidendik chiddush. The Radak says something more, which we would never think of. What's the type of Vayita Eshel? That he built a hotel? No. Shehinhig anshe be'er sheva lahachis orchim. That means to say, says Radak, not that Avrohom Avinu built a hotel. He got everybody in town to make their home into a shtickle hotel. Everybody had a base Chabad. Avrohom came to Be'er Sheva, and it wasn't just that he built accommodations to host travelers. He encouraged all the locals that they too should become generous and kind. So Vayita Eshel Be'er Sheva is not simply Avrohom Avinu having an environment where he could teach others, but that Vayita Eshel Be'er Sheva was already the lesson. He came to the people of Be'er Sheva and said, let's not be selfish. The greatest sign of humanhood is giving. Let's give. And the people of Be'er Sheva listened to Avrohom Avinu, and they all built Eshels. Achil Shtia Levaya, Achil Shtia Lim. So there's an entirely new insight that Radak adds, that Vayita Eshel means one and many. Everybody's home in the vicinity of Be'er Sheva, they all became kind and generous, and they made accommodations for guests. Anayas, a whole new pshat. Now the Medrash, Rabbi, I made it on page 2. I made 2, I underlined 2 Medrashim, Aleph and Beis, as you could see. Aleph is on the right. Vayita Eshel Be'er Sheva. I think it's Rabbi Yehuda Oimer. Rabbi Yehuda says Pardes, a garden. Shal Mashatishal, ask whatever you want. Te'enim Banavim Urimeinu. Figs, grapes, and pomegranates. In other words, he made a garden of various fruits. Now you'll notice that Rashi said that Rav and Shmuel. The Medrash says Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Nachman. So the Rebbe has a Sikha on page 10, which we're not going to learn because we don't have time, in which the Rebbe is going to explain why Rashi chooses to bring the version of Rav and Shmuel rather than Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Nachman. Shol Matishal, ask whatever you want. Igula, Kupat, Chamar, and Bein. Igula is one, I think it's one kind of meat. Kupat is a different kind of meat. Chamar means wine, or kupat may be bread. Chamar means wine, and Bein means eggs. Okay, now Rabbi Zaria b'Shem Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Simen. Another rabbi has a new pshat. What's the pshat? Vayita Eshel, Eshel Sanhedrin. That Avrohom Avinu made a court of law. Anaya Maisa. So how many translations of the word Eshel have? A monument, a single tree, a bunch of trees, a hotel, a tree next to a hotel. Everybody in town became nice and wonderful and sweet and generous, and a Sanhedrin, court of law. Now it happens to be one of the Shav Mitzvahs Nineh, right? There's a chiyuv to make a court system. So it would stand to reason that Avrohom Avinu, as part of his role as Av HaMoin Goyim, Rashi says in some place in Chumash, they made him a king over them, that Avrohom Avinu would feel an obligation to establish a court system. But who would ever think that the word Eshel means a place of judgment? And the correlation, the connection between the word Sanhedrin and Eshel is because he brings that ayah from the story with Shaul HaMelech, that he sat under the Eshel in Ramah where he judged. And as was indicated earlier, that the word Eshel is from the root of the word Sha'al, to question, to ask. Vayita Eshel, he built a reference place. People should come and ask questions about legal matters and about disputes and so forth. Go to the left, Beis. Vayita Eshel is the Amri Achil Shtia Levaya. That he gave them food, drink, and accompaniment, and he told them to bless God. The is the Amri Medrash. What's Medrash mean? A yeshiva. Now, is a yeshiva the same thing as a Sanhedrin? Complicated. In a yeshiva, you learn Torah, and in Sanhedrin, you employ the Torah to paskin halachas. So there's a difference between Medrash and Sanhedrin. Medrash, we could say, Avrohom Avinu built an academy where he taught monotheism, taught one God. He taught the virtues of kindness, how it's worthwhile to be giving rather than taking. Sanhedrin means he built a place people come to have judgment. So how many translations do we have for Eshel now? A monument, a house of worship, yes. A single tree, an orchard of trees, a hotel, a tree and a hotel together. Right? He taught all the people of Be'er they should be generous like he was. A place for judgment and a house of learning. 8 interpretations for the word Eshel. So when you ask me at the beginning of the class, what does Eshel mean? How can I tell you? You have 8, and I'm not even sure we're done yet. Okay, that was the Medrash. Now we're going to read the Chassam Sofer because of lack of time. The Chassam Sofer is on page 6. The Chassam Sofer lived at the same time as the Mittler Rebbe. In other words, relatively speaking, recently, but he's very creative, he's original. Chassam Sofer is not afraid to say what nobody else has said. And the problem is that Chassam Sofer sometimes has very, very long speeches, and I don't have enough time to read them all. But this one is short and sweet, and it's a gewaldige Wort. Vayita Eshel b'Be'er Sheva. You see what I'm reading? Page 6. He planted a tree in Be'er Sheva. V'yirkasham b'Shem Hashem. He announced to the world the name of God. Says the Chassam Sofer. B'chol mokum shenizbase b'Yerushas ha'aretz. Each time Avrohom Avinu was again told that he was inheriting Eretz Yisrael. V'chein kan, and this was a case like this, because it Ramaz liYerushas Sani Plishtim, that because of the pact that he made with Avimelech, Avrohom Avinu had a hint that he would once inherit the lands of the Plishtim, of the Philistines. Shalom Heisef Likre B'Shem Hashem. Every time Hashem gives Avrohom Avinu another indication that Israel is going to be his, he renews his effort in disseminating the name of God. Vayikra Sham, Vayita Eshel, Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem. Avrohom again is being told and inspired and reminded that the Holy Land is going to be his, so he calls in the name of God. What's the meaning of this? It's like the Heilige Chassam Sofer. Loim is a lesson. Afal pi shayidezeh meisev das Hashem ba'anshei ha'aretz. When Avrohom was told by Hashem, I'm going to give you the Holy Land, and Avroham's reaction is to do the exact opposite of what Hezed Neach did, to teach Hashem more. What's he doing? He's postponing his children getting the land. Why? Because the more he teaches the people about Hashem, the more pious they are. The more pious they are, so they're not going to reach a point where Hashem has a right to throw them out. It will be late, it will push back the date, and the Jewish people will be able to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Avrohom says the honor of God in the present is more important than the honor of my children in the future. Each time Hashem tells Avrohom Avinu, I'm going to give your children the land, Avrohom tells the whole neighborhood, thank God. So they tell him, what, thank God? Thank God, God's great, God runs the world. So he encourages them to serve God, so they become more pious. By them becoming more pious, the date for the Jewish people to conquer the land and to acquire the land is going to be pushed further back. And Avrohom Avinu says, God has his business, I got my business. It's the AISHEL's business to give my children the land, and it's my business to give the whole world his name. So the Chassam Sofer is a word. Hashem is offering him Eretz Yisrael, and his reaction is to teach the Goyim more about Hashem, which is postponing his children getting the land Hashem is promising him. Now he's not playing cat and mouse with God. He's not telling the Eibishter, yeah, let me see. That's not the point. The point is that Avrohom Avinu says, Eibishter, I will never allow a self-interest stand in my way. I exist to serve you, not to serve my children. And right now I have a job to do. And if this job today interferes with the blessing of my children, so be it. Now I have to do what I have to do. And therefore, every time Hashem indicates to Avrohom Avinu that his children are going to get a blessing, Avram redoubles his effort of saying, we have to live in the present. And right now, we have to teach the world about the Eibishter. It's a very interesting and worthwhile Chasam Sefer.
Why would they delay the children getting into Israel?
I don't hear you.
Why did it delay?
Because the Goyim are going to be tzaddikim, Hashem can't throw them out.
But who says it did?
No, Hashem is only going to throw them out when it's malasosim, when their rishis is going to reach a full measure. But if they're going to be tzaddikim, then it's not going to reach that stage. I'm sorry? The Eshel means a place where he gathered people, so he could teach them about the Eibishter. Now, At Kan Nigle.
Was there ever one after Avram like him?
That's such a great question. I'm going to give you a cryptic answer. All firsts were like Avram. Shmuel and was like Avram. Yisrael Baal Shem Tov was like Avram. They were just incredibly generous, and they didn't wait for people to come to them. They ran around looking for people. Because Avrohom was not an isolated person. Avrohom set the groundwork. Yitzchak continued Avrahom's legacy, but he behaved totally differently. Yaakov continued Yitzchak's legacy, but the first has to just give and give and give and give and give and give. Because it's unfamiliar. I'm sorry? The Rebbe's the seventh? The Rebbe brings Mashiach Tzedkenu? Okay, the first. I'm not going to argue. The bottom line is the Rebbe didn't move from his Daled Amos. Avrohom Avinu was constantly on the move. Rabbi said this ends the first half of the class, and it virtually ends the Klak's allowance. Now we move on to Pnimius HaTorah, to Kabbalah. And it gets most interesting. It gets most interesting. We have 8 interpretations for AISHEL. A school, a courthouse, a house of worship, a single tree, many trees, a hotel with a tree. All of this, for the most part, is about either Avroham's personal relationship with the Eibishter or Avroham's inspiration to the society around him. And I suppose we could agree that according to most of the interpretations that we read, Vayita AISHEL is not simply about Avrohom Avinu per se. Vayita AISHEL is about Avrohom Avinu's influence on the world around himself. Now we get to Kabbalah. And when you get to Kabbalah, you learn a whole new business. And the business that you learn is that Vayisha AISHEL was not only a physical act, it was a mystical act. Whatever it was Avrohom Avinu was doing was not just happening on the physical planet, it was something that had to do with, say, the Ishtalshalut. The essence of it is, everybody knows that Seder Ishtalshalut is like channels, it's like pathways by which blessing comes from heaven to earth, from a higher level to a lower level. Right? You know, in Tillim we say, Ze'ad Hashem kivinu lei, Nagila v'nismacha b'shuasei, right? And in Shmoneh Esrei we say at the end of Moedim, Ki me'olam kivinu lach, because we always had hope and trust in you. So it says in Chassidus, what is the translation of the word kivinu? From the word kav, which means channels, pathways. Ki me'olam kivinu lach, from the beginning of the thought of creation, the relationship we have with the Eibishter is through channels, through pathways. And the same is true as Hashem Kivinu Lei, our ability to get from the Eibishter through certain channels, through certain pathways. In other words, the relation with the Eibishter in the world passes through steps of a Hishtalshalut. And the Mekubalim translate Vayita AISHEL B'Ve'er Shava as a series of steps by which the Chayes Hadaki comes from a higher level to a lower level. Now I am going to, I think the right word is embellish. It's on page 8. I'm going to read it the way I want to. Now, understand that I'm not making this up completely ad hoc. I'm not that arrogant. I'm working on it. I haven't reached it yet. I saw this someplace. I spent a lot of time preparing, but I forgot where I saw it. So we're going to read it into the Rikanti. The Rikanti says, Vayita AISHEL b'Vayera shava. Do you see the page 8, the Rikanti? Yes or no? It's the section that's scribbled on. Okay? Vayita AISHEL b'Vayera shava. He plants at AISHEL and Vayera shava. So the Rikanti says AISHEL means a tree. And you'll see later on that AISHEL could mean many trees also, for reasons we're not going to get into at the moment. But he links the Vayita AISHEL to the word Vayera shava. What does Vayera shava mean? The well of 7. What does 7 mean? So he says, V'im nimna mimata l'mayla. If you're going to start from the bottom up, Yeh Vayera shava ha'chesed. Vayera shava is going to mean midas ha'chesed. Midas shel Avrohom Avinu, l'shalom with Avrohom Avinu's meaning. Vayita AISHEL. He plants whatever AISHEL means with Vayera shava and midas ha'chesed. V'im nimna mimayla l'mata. But if you count Vayera shava from the top down, Yeh Shviyas ha'asidis. Vayera shava, the 7th aspect means the 10th. In other words, the 7th of the midas is malchus. So Vayita AISHEL Vayera shava means that Avrohom Avinu planted whatever AISHEL means, either in his midah, which is midas hachesed, or in the last of the 10 spheres, which means midas hamalchus. Now there are 2 interpretations to Vayita AISHEL Vayera shava, and I am going to share them with you now. Okay? We are dealing with Avrohom Avinu, and we are offering now mystical insight. Avrohom Avinu is planting an AISHEL. What does that mean? He's opening up channels by which Chayes Alakim come from a higher level to a lower level. And there are basically 2 approaches to this endeavor. And the first is Vayita AISHEL Vayera shava. Avrohom Avinu opens up channels in Atzilus, and they remain in Atzilus. Avrohom Avinu opens up channels. That in the higher world there should be an incredible amount of promise, but Avrohom cannot bring it down below. It stays there. How is going to get down below? This is one way of understanding the Vayita AISHEL, that Avrohom Avinu's influence is only in Lamaila, only in Atzilus. Perhaps you'll see later on why I'm reading it this way. The second interpretation of Vayita AISHEL, which seems to be more simple in the Rikanti, is Avrohom Avinu opens up channels in Atzilus. He plants an AISHEL in Atzilus, either in Chesed and in Malchus, so that it trickles down to the lower world. So the second pshat in Vayita AISHEL is that Avrohom Avinu is able to open up new channels, new passageways, new processes by which life and light and energy come from a higher world to a lower world, starting with Atzilus, and from Atzilus it comes into the lower world. And we continue to read the Rikanti. Ulachala pirushim, in both interpretations, milas AISHEL reimeis al hoatzilus va'abracha. The word AISHEL means an emanation of light and blessing. Vayita AISHEL, he plants an emanation of light and blessing in midas of Atzilus. In other words, he adds such generosity, such abundance to Atzilus that it should spill over into the lower worlds. Like the Chazal tell us that he provided food, drink, and accompaniment, which the Kanti explains. He started off in Atzilus, and it came down all the way to physical food and physical drink and physical accompaniment. So Kabbalah explained Vayita AISHEL in spiritual terms. Either Avrohom Avinu was able to influence Atzilus and it sort of stuck there, and you'll see later on, or he planted, he expanded the Kalim of Atzilus, and it trickles down from Atzilus to the lower worlds. Now turn to page 7. Now we're going to read Ashtikal Arizal, and this Arizal just blew me away. You're not going to be as excited as I was, like, oh my gosh. He says AISHEL is an abbreviation. 3 letters. Aleph means Adoim, which is red. Okay? Shin is Shacher, which is black. And Lamed is Lavan, which is white. Vayita AISHEL, he planted red, black, and white. Okay? What's the Havana Shebadava? According to Kabbalah, in Hishtalshelus, the different levels of Hishtalshelus, one of the many aspects that are spoken about is shayris, is hair. In Kesed, the hair is white. In Atzilus, the hair is black. And in Malchus, the hair is red. White means infinitely generous. Black means controlled but generous. And red means constrained, very, very mitzumtzum, very little. Vayita Eshel is translated, Avrohom Avinu brought down a flow of light from white to black to red, that it should come into the lower worlds. Vayita Eshel, Vayera Shova, Avrohom Avinu created a channel, created a pathway through which Chayes Eliki can descend from the level of white, which is Kesed and Yitzhak, into Shacha, which is Atzilus, into Adam, which is Malchus Atzilus, that should come into the lower worlds. And you could read this also two ways. One way of saying it is that the lower worlds are going to get very limited light. A deeper way of saying it is that no, Avrohom Avinu brings down the white light into the black light and the black light into the red here, so that through the narrow passages should come an overabundance of chayes. So Vayita Eshel now, Apisod, the Pikabala has to do with opening of channels in spiritual worlds, as represented by Be'er Sheva, to come down into the lower worlds. And everything has to pass through steps. Lavan is Keser, Shochet is Zoh, and Adam is Malchus. Okay, I didn't read with you inside, and I hope you forgive me for it. Now we go, Rabbi's side, to the minor. Pardon? Sorry? Red is Tzimtzum, yeah. More than Shochet. Page 11, please. Page 11, please. And now we read Ashtika Lezehav. Remember the kasha we have in Rashi. Eshel means a tree. That is confirmed by the Targum Onkelos and by the Masi Hashem. Rashi does not want to translate Vayita Eshel means a tree. He wants to translate it means a pardes, a collection of many trees, right? So the Zayar says, what's the title Vayita Eshel? The Isa B'Zayar, my first arrow please on page 11. To Chazi, come and see. Eser Netiyos, Avrohom Avinu planted 10 trees. Why did he plant 10 trees? Because the 10 trees go on the 10 Sfiras of Atzilus. Now there's a whole Talmudic dimension to this. Again, I'm not so sure how interested you are in this, but there's a halacha of a negeh to a field that has to do with halachas of kilayim. If a field is too crowded, too many trees in a field, it's considered a forest. And there's no halachas of kilayim. There's much less halachas of kilayim. If a field is too thinly planted, there's not enough trees, there's also fewer halachas of kilayim. If an area is planted with the right number of trees, then the whole thing becomes a steha, it becomes a fruit, a tree field, and the halachas of kilayim are most strict. What is the correct amount of trees in a particular area? So the answer is that a Beis Sa'ah, a near called the Beis Sa'ah, which is 50 by 50 cubits, if it has very large trees, it's 3 trees per 50 amas, 50 by 50. If it has smaller trees, it's 10. Eser Netiyos. So it says in Chazal, Eser Netiyos, Allah L'Meish V'Tzina. The idea that if you have smaller trees, 10 trees to a Beis Sa'ah are considered normal. So it's not considered Troshim, it's not considered a Yar, it's not considered a forest on the one hand. It's not considered isolated trees on the other. It has to do with the Mekach Memker also. Buying and selling, right? If I sell you a tree, did I sell you the land? If I sell you 3 trees, did I sell you the land? So it depends if the proportions are right. If there's too many trees in the area, I sold you only the trees. If there's too few trees in the area, I sold you only the trees. If the ratio of trees to land is proper, then the assumption is that with the tree they sold you the land. What is the correct ratio? 3 large trees or 10 smaller trees in an area of a Beisa, of Chamisham Mam. So it's a halacha nigel the Torah. So the Zayir explains to Rabbi Kabbalah, what's the remez of Eser Netiyos? The 10 Sfiras. But you see, Atzilus is called Olam HaAchdos. It's the world of unity. What does unity mean? Not that only one, that many are made into one. So Vayita Eshel means 10 that is one. Arab the Kasha. Look at what they underlined. Eser Netiyos, Hainu Eser Sfiras Atzilus. The 10 trees are 10 Sfiras of Atzilus. The Inyan the Ochid Lane, Bahu Asra. The idea that the 10 become unified in that space. The Ikri Erev Shvius, it's called the Eve of Shvius. Hainu, this means Hamshachas v'chibur es Sfiras and Sfiras HaMalchus. Bringing down all 10 spheres into Malchus. And of course, why do you want to bring down all 10 spheres into Malchus? So we should be able to get a more generous hashpah from Atzilus. Okay? Last line of the paragraph. As they have the 10 trees having to do with Be'er Shava, bringing down the 10 spheres into the Malchus. Next paragraph. Avrohom Avinu plants an Eshel. So the first translation of Eshel means a single tree. Rashi says Eshel means multiple trees. And the Masi Hashem wants to do a hurdle to explain how they can both work together. So that they explain that Chasidus, it's one and the same thing. Vayita Eshel means 10 plants, 10 trees, 10 spheres. Ki Eshel bepashtos hu ilon. Eshel means a single tree. Skip the parenthesis. The Koi Azad Atzilus, which goes on Atzilus, Shu Bechinas Semeach Atzilus. V'hu Koilel Kol ha'es Sfiras Atzilus. It includes all 10 Sfiras. In other words, Es and Atiyas. Says the Rebbe in the bracket, Umashe Kosa Vayita Eshel Loshen Yachid. When it says he planted one single tree, Hu Mishum Sha'atzilus Ha'elam Ha'achtos. Atzilus is the world of unity. So he planted many trees, but the many trees are not called many trees, they're called singular, one tree, because in Atzilus everything is one, unified. So you have a Pnimius Dika Pshat, a Chsidis Pshat, for Vayita Eshel. The Targum and Rashi are consistent. How are they consistent? The Targum says one tree, Rashi says many trees, and Chassidus says the many are one because you're talking about not physical trees, but trees in Atzilus. Okay? We continue last line of the page, V'hinei. In addition to the interpretation, Vayita Eshel means planting one tree or 10 trees which are one in Atzilus, so that we should open up channels and pathways for the Ashbot to flow from higher to lower. Isa, who Rashi oid beis pirushim. Rashi brings two more interpretations of the pasuk, right? We're translating Vayita Eshel as a single tree. Rashi says it means many trees. Chad Omar Padis. One says it means a garden with many trees. But we just learned. We'll see in a second. V'chad Omer Pundik. In other words, it's a hotel lachsanye for hosting guests. Ubay kol minei peres, which has many, many fruits. V'lahapirush she'eshel upadis. According to the interpretation, that Eshel means an orchard of many trees. Mevuer gamkein ba'adrushim shuayes and atiyas. It's the 10 trees. And this garden, which has many trees, which are providing fruit, is called Eshel Loshen Yachid, because in Atzilus the many are unified. What about the interpretation? Vayita Eshel means a hotel. Amram Pirash Hashenu Shu Pundik Mavur. Skip 2 lines. Bebir Rashatevis Achila Eshel Achila Shtil Levai. That the other interpretation, that it made a hotel, means he provided them with food, drink, and accompaniment. Now, Rabbi said, this is why I told you what I said to you earlier. When you read this Maimer, and you see how the Rebbe divides Eshel meaning a tree and many trees, versus a hotel, and he says, what's the difference? A hotel means to feed people. An Eshel, tree and many trees, is not about feeding people. You get the distinct impression that the Rebbe holds that the difference in the first interpretation of Eshel and the second interpretation of Eshel is that according to the first interpretation of Eshel, Avrohom Avinu opens up channels in Atzilus, but they never come down here. They remain up there, like I told you a few minutes before. The second interpretation of the Maimed is Eshel means not only is it channels being opened in Atzilus, but the channels come down into this world as well, in feeding and irrigating people, giving people water and giving people accompaniment. And the Rebbe goes into a shtickle hezbed, what's the difference between the two Rosh Tevisim? Achila Shtia Lina, eat, drink, and sleep, versus Achila Shtia Levaya. Basically, he says, when you have a guest and give him food, drink, and a place to sleep, it all happens inside the house. Food, drink, and accompaniment means you're going out with that person out of the house, which is even more generous. Not only is Avrohom Avinu bringing down Atzilus into his home, he brings Atzilus down into his home and then radiates out into the street. So this is two interpretations of Yossi, but Vayita Eshel. Now, if you'll keep track of the Rekanti and Arizal, it all fits very nicely. They're all saying essentially one thing. That is that AISHEL is mystical, it's not physical. AISHEL is an Atzilus. And Avrohom Avinu is opening up channels and pathways. In one interpretation, he's opening up these channels and pathways in Atzilus, and they're stuck in Be'er Sheva, and they're going to come down at some later date. And in the second interpretation, Avrohom Avinu plants Taka, AISHEL, in Atzilus, and Be'er Sheva, and already in the time of Avrohom Avinu, it comes down into this world, and perhaps also not only does it come down into Avrohom Avinu's home, but Levaya, he takes it from his house and puts it out into the world. Okay? But there's another interpretation. And Vayita AISHEL, the Be'er Sheva, means a Sanhedrin, court of law. So I'm going to ask you to turn to page 13. Listen to Tzemach Tzedek's Maimon. On the left, where I made my arrow. Eid Amru b'Medrash Rabbi Sham, it says in Medrash, Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Simon Amar AISHEL Sanhedrin. Okay, and he brings a pasuk. Next line, please. I circle the word Eshel. What's the pshat Sanhedrin? Ki Sanhedrin hayudanin hashpa. The job of Sanhedrin was to judge. What is judge? Not to give, but to give correctly. Hanimshach Beis Hamikdash, that was given from the Beis Hamikdash. Yumshach letzadikim v'lei l'rshoyim. That you come to the righteous and not to the evil. So what's the tithe Vayita AISHEL? According to Kabbalah, that Vayita AISHEL means that Avrohom Avinu is opening up pathways in the higher worlds for a flow of hashpah from the higher worlds to the lower worlds. Vayita AISHEL, he also puts a judge that this hashpah from the higher worlds to the lower world should go where it's supposed to go, not where it's not supposed to go. It's not hefke petrishke. It's not everybody gets what they want. You get what you deserve. So Vayita AISHEL means he makes a Sanhedrin that should direct the hashpah l'makam haroy, should go where it's supposed to go. That's all. Then in the next line he brings nochatifa pshat, that he explains that Vayita AISHEL, he says, hey, listen to this. AISHEL means Sanhedrin, right? How many members were there to the Sanhedrin? 70. He says we have 70 holidays in the year. 52 Shabbos and 18 days of Yom Tov. 70, pratik. 52 Shabbos and 18 Yom Tov. You have whatever it is, 7 days of Pesach, 8 days of Sukkot, that's 15, and then you have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, Shavuos, and Yom Kippur, 18 days. So he explains, what's the pshat Vayita AISHEL? That Avrohom Avinu was opening up 70 days, not of judgment. Judgment means constraint, but the generosity, overflow, giving more. And he explains that if Vayita AISHEL means Sanhedrin, but not a Sanhedrin that constrains, that limits, but 70, which goes into 70 holidays when you reveal a higher level, he says Vayita AISHEL means Avrohom Avinu opened up pathways, channels from Atika Kadisha, from completely higher than Seder Ishtalshalos. So the same Sanhedrin is interpreted in two ways. First, Vayita AISHEL means Sanhedrin who judge and limit the hashpah. Then Vayita AISHEL Sanhedrin means hashpah from Atika Kadisha, where the hashpahs come from such a high level that it goes back into the right place, but it comes with an incredible abundance. Look at the second line from the bottom, please. Now that we interpret it, by combining the first translation of Sanhedrin, which means judgment, and the second translation of Sanhedrin, which means they're coming from Atika Kadisha, al derech zeh yuvan, turn the page, we can now understand Pirush HaMedrash Rabbah Vayita AISHEL Haynu HaSanhedrin Shehim Sheich HaOretz Atika Kadisha Shemisham Nimshach Ayin Skein Shem HaSanhedrin. That Hashem is focusing, Avrohom Avinu was focusing the flow of godly blessing from a higher world to a lower world through the judgment of the Sanhedrin, but their role is not to constrain, but to give an incredible abundance. Now go down 6 lines to the top of the page. And he goes back to the Arizal. The Rashat Eshel, Rashat Tevis, Adam Shachalavan. You see? You see what I'm reading? 7 lines from the top. Eshel stands for red, black, and white, which, as I explained to you before, red is Malchus, black is Zoh, and white is Kesed. And normally, red, black, and white means that the light is being diminished. But if you translate Vayita AISHEL Sanhedrin judgment, that's taka true. The black diminishes the white, and the red diminishes the black. But if you translate Vayita Eshel Sanhedrin, who give Matika Kaddish, it's the other way around. The white sweetens the judgment of the black, and the black sweetens the judgment of the red, that we should get more. V'retzein Elema. Give me a shayah, v'retzein Elema. Shayidei Vayita Eshel. When the Eibishter and Avrohom Avinu plants Eshel. Shem Ayin's Kenim She Sanhedrin, the 70 judges of Sanhedrin, whose role it is not just to limit, but to give a hashpah from Atika Kadisha. Sheshosh Mabchinas Atik. Shenema Vayisarish Gamanaka. Ayedei Zeh Mamtik Shayres Shcheres Dezah Ubechines V'das Reish Chakagama. Their role is not just to bring the life from the white to the black to the red, but to sweeten. The chayes is going through a funnel. It's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. Vayita Eshel, Rabbi Avinu is expanding the channels through which the hashpah is flowing from a higher level to a lower level, that it should be more generous and more abundant. So in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, Vayita Eshel is not a physical garden or tree or group of trees. Vayita Eshel means setting up a system by which chayes alatik can flow from a higher level to a lower level. And at least according to the last interpretation that we just read, the whole point is you taka want that the flow should go to a good place, but you also want it to be abundant and generous. So how many interpretations have Vayita Eshel? We forgot. And believe me, there's more. On the next page is another one, but of course we are out of time. Okay? So I'll see you next week.